One of the cool things about the game is that we're trying to capture the feel of the films. So what we've tried to do is build our maps and our battle structures so that they are generally plane aligned like the film, but at the same time, it's space, so you can do whatever you want. So like as a bomber, it is perfectly valid to fly upside down beneath the Star Destroyer and be launching your bombs upward into the base of the ship. It lets you have your cake and eat it too, in terms of feeling like Star Wars, but giving you a lot of control. Hi, this is Ian Frazier, creative director on Star Wars Squadrons.
Hi, I'm Shadi Mallak, lead UI artist on Star Wars Squadrons.
And this is every Starfighter in Star Wars Squadrons. Fundamentally, Star Wars Squadrons is a game about being a pilot, a combat pilot in the Star Wars universe. So you're going to get into iconic ships like the X-Wing and the TIE Fighter, blast around in 5v5 space battles, both in single player, where you've got a story set after Return of the Jedi, and a multiplayer where we have two different competitive modes.
So today we're going to look at all 10 playable ships in Star Wars Squadrons. We're going to have an in-depth look at their design, gameplay, and how we stay true to the films.
The fighter class is the multi-role class within Star Wars Squadrons. So these are the ships that are good at everything, but they're not great at any one thing. If you want to be flexible, able to switch back and forth between offense and defense, fighters are where it's at.
The cool thing with the TIE Fighter is it's one of the ships where we have a lot of references from the films. For any of the 8 ships, we would always start by the movies. That's like the holy grail. We would supplement that by looking at schematics, drawings, and various manuals that we had. Grabbing all of that, we would do first concept art in 2D. So this is really just like in Photoshop, grabbing different parts, moving them around, rescaling them, addressing all our gameplay needs, but making sure that we stay true to the Star Wars aesthetic and the vehicle-specific character. So for the TIE Fighter, it's a ship that actually does have already a nice big central screen, and we just had to kind of manipulate a few elements that were already existing in the cockpit to go and create the extra gameplay elements we needed.
We tried to act like we were Incom, like we were Sinar Fleet Systems, like we were the fictional companies within the Star Wars universe that builds these ships. We're looking at it partially as game developers, but partially also from a purely fictional lens and going, well, if you had to really build one of these ships, for real, what would you do? Running this mixture between the films and trying to capture the prop, but then knowing that the prop is a prop, and then looking at what it would take to really fly one of these things, and then finally knowing that, well, it's a game, so there's constraints around that as well. We try to take all those things together to end up with the result that you see today. The biggest challenge with getting the TIE Fighter to play the way that we wanted was simply that the design of it is actually built around this sort of porthole window, right? You have this front-facing window that everything's focused around, and we need to make sure the player has enough vision, frankly. So there was a lot of playing with the distance between where that window is, where the control column is, where your seat is, so that both in 2D and of course in VR, that the amount of visibility you have there is kind of maximized, while we keep the iconic look. Fun fact, as we were working on it, we ran into a problem. The TIE Fighter interior, where the struts are in the window, don't match the exterior. There was actually a production error in A New Hope, so the inside of the TIE doesn't match up with the outside, the angle of the struts is different. We had to decide, okay, which of these is going to be correct. Of course, being a pilot game focused within the cockpit, we chose the cockpit view.
We needed for gameplay to have additional screens. So we have a central console, but we've got a lot of gameplay components. We didn't want it to be 2D UI overlay. We want players to have that pilot fantasy of really using the instruments that are in the ship. We had to add screens. We were looking at reference that was outside the period. And if you look at First Order TIEs, they have these arms inside with like these triangular screens. The discussion we had from there is like, well, this is not the right time period, it's not the right model, we don't want to go there. But could we maybe imagine that there is a prototype of it that's already around in our timeline?
That's one of the nice things with our time period is we're right after Endor, so both sides are kind of reappraising what they're doing a little bit, and we see some interesting technology evolve that makes sense fictionally. With the TIE specifically, you'll notice that in the prologue, which is set around the same time period as the first film, you don't have any missiles, you don't have any countermeasures, you have the basic lasers, engines, TIE Fighter. But then when we jump forward to the post-Endor period, where most of the game is set, now that the Titan Squadron, the Imperial group that you're with, they start experimenting with these ships and trying things that are a little bit more out there. So you're going to get some non-stock options for weapons and components and stuff once you get into that later time period. The X-Wing and the TIE Fighter needed to be quite different. This is a game that we've tried to balance, but balance in an asymmetric way, because each faction fictionally kind of has its own strengths and weaknesses, and we wanted to lean into those in actual gameplay. The nice thing the X-Wing has is it's got all three systems. It's got its engines, it's got its lasers, and it's got shields. You can shift those double front or behind you, which is something we've heard in the films. But then the TIE fighters canonically don't have shields at all. So we said, okay, what do we do to make that fair, to get to kind of balance these two ships out that have similar roles but are on opposite factions, and we need to keep more or less lined up. If you fly the two in our game, the X-Wing feels a bit heavier. It's got a bit more substance to it. The TIE Fighter has zippier turns. It's just a faster ship and a more easily maneuverable ship. And so that helps kind of counterbalance the shields in and of itself. But the ability to control the shields, to put them to front or back, is giving another edge to the X-Wing. So how do we counter that? Well, what we do is we use the same buttons that we would use for shield control in an X-Wing. On a TIE Fighter and some of the other TIEs, we use that for emergency power conversion, which is the ability to pull all the juice out of your engines and dump them into your lasers, or vice versa on the fly. So you can quickly get out of trouble or quickly juice up your weapons for a massive attack in a hurry in a way that the Rebel ships can't.
Some of the things we had to do for the X-Wing were changing the viewport, kind of slimming down the struts a bit. It's a bunch of invisible changes that make it feel like the movie. I had to take the existing dashboard and, its angular shape and how high it is. That's iconic, so we obviously had to have that. We panned and scaled and kind of moved around to create additional room so we'd be able to fit all the gameplay components. For each of these changes, basically, it's a slide in the deck, showing the original, showing the intended change, and justifying why. But any change we were doing, using the materials that were already in the cockpit, paint or icons or buttons that came from elsewhere, and just making sure everything was really authentic to that canon ship.
We were treating them like real things, right? So both from the fictional standpoint, but also as props from the films. We would ask, okay, it's 1977, you're at ILM, you're building a prop, you don't have a flat LCD screen, those don't exist yet. You're going to notice that the lights for your laser charge are actual LEDs, old style, like a little bulb with a plastic coating over it that's coloring the light. It's one of those things that makes the game, I think, feel more real, because the teams tried to approach it as if it is real.
If we were making just any ship, just for the game, from a player experience standpoint, you're going to put the UI element exactly where you need it, the size you need it. In this case, the fantasy is being a pilot in the Star Wars universe, so it doesn't make sense to do that. You'd be sacrificing the whole fantasy that we're trying to offer players because you're just trying to be as efficient as possible. Even once we had the UI there with the right color scheme and everything looking great and retro, it still wasn't enough. We wanted players to feel like they were really there. So working with shader artists, we went and did materials. We went to the point of being able to emulate the screen resolution for each display, having refresh rates and keeping the frame rate down to give that retro choppiness, like to the animation.
So how do we create the sense that these ships are real? The first thing we did was the flight model for the X-Wing and TIE Fighter, and everything's really been built upon that foundation. And what we've tried to do with them is look at everything we see in the films, even some of the animated series and so on, to look at what are the boundaries? What are these ships capable of? What are they not capable of? For instance, there's no vertical thrusters on an X-Wing. They don't go straight up and down. That's not a thing that X-Wings do. So we did not want that as part of our flight model because it doesn't fit the fiction. At the same time, we wanted to create the idea of kind of World War II combat piloting as our foundation, as it was for Lucasfilm. And then from there go, how do we up that a notch? How do we take things like power management and eventually boost and the drift maneuver to take it and really take advantage of the fact that you're in space and we can do some cool over-the-top stuff. We ended up building an entirely new entity to handle how our ships work within the Frostbite engine because we knew we were trying to do something that had never been done before in our engine, quite like what we're doing. We based it a lot off of the older games, like the original X-Wing and TIE Fighter, used that as a starting point in terms of the kind of banking maneuvers we wanted to have, in terms of how we wanted them to handle turns and so on. We did that as a foundation early on, and then we started layering things in like power management and eventually the drift maneuver. In Legends, there was this idea in Star Wars of the etheric rudder, and this idea that there was some kind of medium in space that you actually kind of piloted through, which was sort of the fictional reasoning behind ships handling more like aircraft, less like spacecraft. Now, honestly, I don't even know if that's canon anymore or not, but in terms of our thinking around how we make the ships move, it helps as a visual representation of how ships would move through a medium.
These are the ships that are meant to go after other starfighters. So they're the most agile and fast, and they really pack a punch. They're also the most fragile, so you have to watch out. They're not meant to go after capital ships. When going about designing the TIE Interceptor, the idea was that the TIE Fighter, the Interceptor, and the Bomber, they're part of the same line. And when you're flying Imperial, there's a certain standard, and there's efficiency in the design. But we did still want each ship to have its own unique character. The way we did that for the Interceptor, it's a ship that's made to hunt. but it's also more fragile. So it's little details. Like if you look at the viewport, the spokes and then the rim around, they're thinner, more refined, giving it a more precise look, but also a bit more fragile. And the other big thing that we were able to use were those screens that we were adding on the side that we spoke about earlier. So each of the 3 ships got a custom shape. The one for the Interceptor are these kind of aggressive triangles that kind of cement its look as, a hunter.
So one of the most fun parts of working on the cockpits for Squadrons was figuring out how you actually fly a TIE fighter. And this is true for the fighter, the interceptor, and the bomber, is that if you look at the films, we see very little of the actual interior of those ships and how physically you control it. Now in X-Wing, it's a joystick, but with the TIE, we see that there's a yoke, but it's not really clear how that works. And so we've ended up with this design around the pushing and pulling, what it does when you twist, like what's a pitch, what's a yaw, how do you roll one of these ships, and make sure that what we do doesn't contradict what we see in the films, but is internally consistent and makes sense from a player standpoint. So if you're playing the game, especially if you're in VR, and you look down at what your pilot's hands are doing, it always makes sense. So when we built the TIEs, part of figuring out how they would control was sort of the physicality of it. So we actually built simple wooden armatures that were the controls, like kind of imagine the yoke of a TIE fighter. So that then when we did motion capture, performance capture of our actors for cinematics, they were sitting inside these simple, wooden cockpits and then would work on the motions. We're having a lot of fun with it. So one of the things that makes the TIEs feel very distinctive from the New Republic ships, and the TIE Interceptor is probably the best example of this, is actually the sound design. So those core mechanics of, throttling your engine and that sweet spot in the middle of the throttle where you turn better, those are the same between the factions, but the way we treat that from an audio standpoint is quite different. If you're in a Rebel ship, if you listen to it, there's rattles and clanks and clunks, and there's this distinct feeling that there's duct tape somewhere behind you holding that ship together. Whereas the TIEs, it's clean, it's pristine, it's precise, especially with the Interceptor. You're going to notice higher pitch, you're going to notice more kind of clean hums, very little noise in the mix. The whole idea is that these things are engineered to perfection, and that's you're experiencing kind of, the Imperial cleanliness and design there. The A-Wing is one of my favorite ships in all of Star Wars, so we had a lot of fun developing it. It has that very aerodynamic shape. This thing is just, kind of a wedge flying through space. And yeah, I know there's no air in space, but there's always that sensation that this thing is incredibly fast. At the same time, it's pretty small, and you have that feel that, one stray blaster bolt's going to make your day real bad. And we wanted to capture that in all of the tuning and design around the A-Wing.
You'll look at the Rebel ships, and you'll notice that they use different fonts. So we have all these fonts that are from the indie universe that you've seen on screen in the movies. We've used them in different combinations to help the character of each ship kind of feel a bit different. It takes, a team, of experts to bring the ships to the players like this.
One of the things that's fun in the game is we've been really careful with our collision, the actual collision geometry around all the sort of stuff you could smash into in the game. And as a result, if you're in an A-Wing, you can pretty easily fly into, say, the trench along the side of a Star Destroyer. Fly into that area that's super tight, but that's a place where you can legitimately get in there, potentially lose a pursuer as they might be a bit bigger and smash off the side. We wanted to lean into that idea of being super fast, super agile, but small, and you hit like a truck. So you can have this crazy experience of being very cautious as everything around you can cause your death pretty easily, but being able to get in and out and do these awesome hit and fade attacks just make you feel like an ace.
The cockpit is pretty cramped as well. In VR, we had to make a few modifications. There's like this metal rim, right, that like runs kind of across like the glass. And where it was positioned in the cannon ship, it would be in the way of some of the instruments that the player needs to use. So we had to move it and thin it and kind of play with that a bit, while still giving you the impression that it's the same position, the same look, even being able to let you personalize it like hanging flare, but not like intrude upon the gameplay elements.
Well, if this is a real ship that existed and you got a fuzzy Ewok that you wanted to put in the real world, somebody would sell an attachment to actually hook those things up, and so that's what we built.
If you look down, and it's just like that classic World War II cockpit stuff that you'd expect to see, it's just a great look. It's the only ship that has a radial speed gauge with an arrow that actually moves up and down. And it just gives it that feeling of speed, like almost like a muscle car, So yeah, I really enjoyed working on the A-Wing.
The bombers are defined by being a bit slower, a bit heavier, a bit tankier, built to drop that massive ordnance that's going to take out big capital ships, things like Star Destroyers and MC-75s. So they might need a little support getting there, but once they get there, they can do an obscene amount of damage.
For the bomber, we wanted obviously to make it look different than the Interceptor and Fighter because it has a very different role, and the exterior is also very different, so we needed to bring that inside as well for the player. Our job was made easier because the bomber is a bigger ship, so especially when you're looking around the interior, you'll see there's actually room where people can sit behind you. And all that's designed and looks very different than the interior from the other two ships. Even if you look to the side, you'll see that there's a door and there's the ordnance, you know, like you got all the bombs on the other side of the compartment. So it makes it already feel quite different just from that. You can actually go against the capital ships with it. You can make serious damage. It needed to feel tankier. Kind of the reverse approach that we had for the Interceptor. For the bomber, we went and made the frames of the viewport thicker, more armored, kind of like you could ram something and really take a lot of punishment. Once again, those secondary screens that we introduced, we gave it a different shape for the bomber, something bulkier that just kind of confirmed its role on the team.
The ships that have the off-center cockpit, like the bomber or the TIE Reaper, were quite challenging because as a player, you don't want to feel like all your control is offset by, you know, a meter or two from where the ship's actually located. It becomes incredibly hard to tell, like, can I get through that hole? I don't know, where is the hole relative to me? So what we ended up doing is we have the pilot's seat is technically off-center, but the pivot point for the ship has been moved relative to the broader shape of the ship. Effectively, you're driving it from the center of the ship, even though your seat is a little offset. What we do to make the ships feel weighty is largely playing with the tuning of their engines. So how fast they accelerate, how fast they decelerate, and how much momentum they preserve when you go into a different maneuver. If you're in a bomber and you start to turn, the degree to which you have forward momentum there helps sell that sense that it's actually kind of a heavy ship. Obviously the top end speed relative to other ships also helps that sense of weight. And there's a lot of kind of tricks of presentation that help. It doesn't make a bit of difference in the way the ship handles, but in your mind, that sensation that it's a kind of beefier ship helps make it feel slower, feel weightier. Similarly with the sound design, when we're using a lot of lower pitches, that helps kind of correlate in your mind with the slower, beefier, stronger ship than the more like high-pitched, tightly tuned interceptors. So the Y-Wing has been a really interesting challenge for us because we're trying to capture the feel of the ship, and it's got a lot of similarities with the X-Wing in terms of its structure and cockpit, but you still want it to feel distinctive. The cockpit team's done a great job of looking at the instrumentation, looking at the shape language that you see within that dashboard in the films, and then trying to make use of that as well as possible. Whether it's the kind of like tube that works its way over the instruments, or the actual shapes you see of the instruments there. We've tried to make use of those and really lean into them so it feels right for a Y-Wing. At the same time, kind of that heavy structure you have around you, around kind of the left and right behind you, you have a lot less of a window to your astromech than you would in, say, an X-Wing.
What's really interesting with the Y-Wing is it's one of the oldest ships that the Rebels have. You can definitely see it in the design. So it was quite a challenge for us to design something that would keep its unique character, but make it playable, because the ship is devoid of screens, for starters. Like, the only one that you see in the movies is the targeting computer that comes in from the side. But besides that, it doesn't actually have any displays. It's kind of like harkens back to these sci-fi ships that had basically blinking lights, like these huge computers, right, with like levers and blinking lights. You look at the Y-Wing, the cabin for the pilot, it's been a versatile ship over different time periods, and we've even seen it have two people in there, having the pilot and having like a rear gunner. So it's a very long cabin, and the pilot is kind of sitting with like his legs out a bit more compared to some of the other ships. We had to play, you know, with like the dimensions and do a bunch of tricks to make it feel like the shots, especially the ones you see in episode 4, but like make it playable. So one of the things we did was bring in displays that we designed for the X-Wing and layer them with some of the iconic things that were in the Y-Wing, like the tube and then that cone with the glass lens that we used for the ship status indicator. Even on the screens, I paid close attention to the patterns that you have on those side panels. So like the painting patterns and those big ribbed glass lights that kind of strobe. We took those patterns and we made vector versions of them, and we used them as backing for the information on the displays. It was quite a challenge to be able to try and keep that look, but introduce screens without kind of disfiguring the Y-Wing.
The Y-Wing, for the longest time, has been our example of how you make two very different builds using components. By default, they're built to be bombers. They're built to be really good at taking down enemy capital ships, not as good at dogfighting. Depending on the components, you can slant them very heavily toward taking out capital ships and just accept that you're going to be awful in a dogfight and need the support of your friends. Or you can slant them more the other way and be more of a heavy assault craft, where you're never going to be as zippy as an A-Wing, and it's going to be trouble if people get on your tail. But if they're dumb enough to come at you from the front, you can really end their day in a hurry.
What makes a ship part of the support class is that you'll be piloting it to help your friends and hinder your enemies. So you're going to have a bunch of tricks up your sleeve that kind of give you the edge and slow down your enemies.
The TIE Reaper and the U-Wing, both of our support ships, actually come from the film Rogue One. And we were really excited to bring them to life in the game because they haven't had as much exposure yet. The Reaper in particular, just, you gotta love that design. It's so cool. I think it's probably my favorite ship on the Imperial side. Originally, we looked at support and we said, okay, we want kind of the entry-level class, the class that's gonna be the easiest to use, that can be helpful for your team, but isn't as effective at killing. Did not work for a couple of reasons. First is that the X-Wing and the TIE Fighter are what everybody knows. So no matter what we do, those are going to be the ships that anybody new or more casual is going to gravitate toward. The other thing is we found that in a dogfighter, simply, hunting down enemies and shooting them is the most basic thing you can do. That is the most accessible and fundamental part of gameplay. We ended up pivoting our mindset for support ships to be less the entry-level ship and actually the other way around. They're more of a high-level ship that takes a bit more skill to use effectively, but they're the specialists. You can use a TIE Reaper to sort of batten down the hatches around your area, to put up turrets, drop mines, to defend a zone. You can do it to make your entire team invisible to enemy radar, to ionize enemy shields and bring them down, to focus fire. They're very versatile in terms of what they can do with the widest array of different components that can be equipped.
We were bringing a ship to the screen, especially its cockpit, that no one had seen yet. So the outside has been seen, but this is going to be new to our players. There were some models that existed because the ship was designed for use for Jedi Fallen Order. Our biggest consideration was visibility from the ship. We kind of cut the dashboard down and made it shorter so the pilot could sit closer to the front windows. They still look like what you expect when you're seeing it from the outside, but once again, through little tricks, we make it more accessible for players.
Working on the U-Wing has been interesting because, as you may know, it's a two-seater craft. And so trying to balance your perspective in a way that feels right, that feels like you're in the left-hand seat across the front there, but also pilots in a way you expect, where it's not difficult to fly through a hole in a structure because, actually my center point is over there, has been really challenging. Trying to make sure that our physics lines up with kind of what your brain expects as a pilot, especially in VR, versus the actual center point of the ship. The other big challenge, as you may know, is that the U-Wing has S-foils. Its wings unfold. So when the U-Wing is jumping into hyperspace, you've got the wings locked and it's in its iconic U shape. But once you're ready for combat, they fold back into more of frankly a Y shape, but don't tell the Y-wings, for combat. And that means that their breadth is quite a bit bigger. So if you're flying through, say, the interior of a space station, you've got to be a lot more aware of your surroundings in that U-Wing than you might need to in something like an A-Wing. With both the U-Wing and the Reaper, they have places in them to have, whether it's a co-pilot or passengers in the back. And if you look inside them in the game, you do see those seats, but we don't actually have them filled. Now, partially that's because our game is set in space. You're not landing on planets that you wouldn't have anywhere to drop them off. Not a lot of reason for them to be there fictionally. But also because from a performance standpoint, the way the game runs, we're trying to make sure we're giving you the things that matter the most and giving all the attention there. So the ships and lasers and explosions there in front of you. If we have a high fidelity character 2 feet away from you, everything out the window is going to have to look worse in order to make performance space for that character right next to you.
Working on the U-Wing was easier for 2 reasons. One, because it's one of the later ships I tackled in production, so we were already getting really used to finding creative solutions to the challenges we'd faced on the other ships. Also, as luck would have it, just the design with that big central screen, and it has all that, the mess of wires and connectors, and it has a secondary monitor on a swivel. I was able to just take that monitor, move it, elsewhere where it fit with the order that we have for components, because every ship is different. But gameplay-wise, you want people to know that the radar is going to be over on the left, the speed's going to be on the left because it fits with the controller, that kind of stuff. So that let us easily move it around without having to modify it as much. So what we did for the U-Wing is more rescale and move around existing elements, and we were able to quickly find a home for most of our gameplay components. I think for the most part, I only had to modify the top part of the central console, so it would be able to display our loadout. And we used something that's existing that you saw, like this kind of glass part with red lights in the movie. It was close enough to our laser bar, so it was a really a good fit.
So we've added these 2 new ships, the TIE Defender and the B-Wing. We designed the game around the 8 core playable ships, But fortunately, thanks to all the support of our players, we're able to add these entirely new ships that fill new niches within the gameplay, and we think they're going to add a lot to the game.
Even though the ships are part of existing classes, they play very differently. They're quite unique, and they get their own unique components as well.
A big part of the design of Squadrons is about team composition, and the way that you kind of lay out your team and the way that you support each other. Like, okay, you know, I'm going to need some people that are handling just enemy ships, and I need some people that are focusing on the objectives, and so on. If we added a whole new class, like we called them the Heavy or something, that compositional picture got a bit more complicated. So instead we went, how do we fit these into the existing kind of roles that we have, but offset enough in that kind of spectrum of design that they all feel unique. We don't want the TIE Defender to feel like, it's a TIE Fighter with a different cockpit. You want it to feel distinctive, but we still want to understand the role that, okay, this is a flexible ship that can be used both offensively and defensively in the way that a TIE Fighter would. I'm a big fan of it from the TIE Fighter days, like the PC game TIE Fighter. We were so excited to see that come back into canon, and we went, okay, well, we've got to let people fly this thing. The reason we put it in that kind of fighter class is that it is meant to be flexible. It's something that can help offensively, defensively. Where it's a bit different than, say, the TIE Fighter or TIE Interceptor is it's really good within a given area. It's not as good at getting from point to point. Heavily leans on boost and drift for all your maneuverability. So you can really hold a spot, but if you need kind of superiority over a large space to hold the front, you don't want to rely just on defenders. You're going to want to mix that up with a different team composition.
The TIE Defender being part of the same, line as the TIE Fighter, Bomber, or Interceptor obviously has to have a lot of things in common with them. That's kind of the point with that series for the pilots to just hop in, your home. All the ships in the series, the main difference was the viewports and also the secondary monitors that we have on both sides of that central column that's standard in all of them. So the TIE Defender still has that console in the middle, and it has its own set of panels on the side. One big thing with the TIE Defender is it has shields. So it means it has more power management going on, and also has more information that you need to be able to consult as a player as you're flying that ship. We had fun playing with different shapes and patterns, and we found one that both felt robust enough to kind of feel like this is a ship that can take punishment, but also still felt aggressive, a bit closer to the TIE Interceptor than the Bomber, let's say.
We want it to look like the Empire spent more money on this ship. There's a little bit more technology going on, a little bit more stuff built in compared to the other three core TIE Fighters.
The ship status indicator, if you look at the other three basic TIEs besides the Reaper, what we're showing you is the silhouette of the ship seen from the front. Because the Defender has shields, we wanted to show you a top-down view so it would be clear right off the bat you're looking at your front and rear shields. I love its silhouette, so aggressive with all those spikes when you see it from the top, but it's also a very challenging shape to work with for the UI to try and, surround it with the shields and fit that nicely within the screen. So I spent quite a bit of time doing different iterations and patterns and line art that would really go well with the silhouette and still stay clear for the player.
In Rebels, the TIE Defender is just straight up better than the other TIEs. In the context of a competitive game, that doesn't work great. It's like, all right, well, you've got 5 ships, take that one, it's clearly superior. So what we've done lore-wise is that after Thrawn's initiative, spoilers, the things go sideways on Lothal, that Defender initiative is put out of service, but the plans are still around. So in our time period, when the Empire is not doing so well, the plans still exist, but they don't have the resources they once did. So you're getting kind of a second generation, more suited for mass production version. The whole game was designed to make you feel like an ace pilot, but the Defender is a whole other level. It's like, all right, now I'm the elite within the ace pilot group when I really master that ship, which is a great feeling. The cool thing about the B-Wing is it's the last ship from the Return of the Jedi era that we wanted to bring to the light that we never got a chance to do with the core game. So the B-Wing is really cool because it's got this unique gyroscopic cockpit. You can actually keep your cockpit stable, but control the entire rest of the ship around the cockpit. Now, partially this is just cool, just for fun, but also you can be using this tactically. So it's something that improves your missile evasion. It's something you can use to aim your bombs. So you can have your ship like aiming upward, fly under a ship and shoot your bombs straight up, for example. And beyond that, it actually is increasing the rest of your ammo. So if you take that component, the one that lets you control your gyroscopic cockpit, it's doubling whatever your other auxiliary does.
So we were wondering, maybe we would only allow you to have it vertically or horizontal, and it would just kind of ease by itself in between those motions once you triggered it. Or we could allow total control. I'm pretty stoked that we were actually able to allow you granular control so you can actually place it at any angle that you want as you're piloting. We decided to go kind of old school with a dial that looks like something you'd have on an old fighter plane, and you actually have a needle that's like a B-wing silhouette shape, and you see it rotate around the dial, so you get like this precise feedback.
You've got a bubble cockpit, so if you're doing free look, or especially if you're in VR, you could be just looking, out the window as that big wing is moving along.
You'll see it block out the light like across your dashboard.
You feel the rumble if you're using your controller. You've got that kind of shuddering metal scraping sound as the entire ship moves around you. You can be firing your lasers, your beam cannon or whatever, while you're rotating the wing, and so you see the lasers kind of spiraling around your cockpit as that's rotating and you're still firing. This ship is ungainly. You go flying into a tight tunnel, like in our new map, Foster Haven, you gotta really be paying attention to where the constraints of that ship are. You just smack into a wall. And so having that level of situational awareness, having the new instrumentation that lets you actually control and be aware of where the rest of your ship is a whole new kind of experience with the B-Wing that's really unlike anything else in the game.
The references we had were mainly the ships that were built for the original trilogy. So you've never seen them in the movie, like the inside, but they were built like as part of that ship they were using for those outside shots as they were flying through space. And then there was references from the Rebels show for the prototype of the B-Wing.
From a fictional standpoint, the Blade Wing was the prototype, so what we're trying to capture is more of the standard B-Wing that comes along a bit later. And also because there's just something cool about feeling like when you saw Return of the Jedi, that cockpit was actually there in that B-Wing. You just couldn't quite see it because of the camera work, and we're finally getting to sort of reveal that to the world, very much in first person for the first time.
The B-Wing being one of the later ships to be introduced, it's little subtle things that will set it apart, making the screens a bit higher resolution and playing, with the type of CRT or LCD monitors you're seeing in some of the panels. The B-Wing has a mix of like small CRTs for like its radar and then the ship status indicator. But then it does have a nice big LCD display for the combat screen, closer to what you'd see on the U-Wing.
So the B-Wing in lore is a bomber. It's a bomber / assault craft, but being a great bomber is a big part of its identity. So we wanted to keep that concept. But it's also such a unique ship. It's something that a lot of our fans have wanted to play. We've got a lot of feedback of the B-Wing, where is it? Okay, we put it in, guys. It's gonna be okay. It's that idea of being able to control your bombs specifically that from a mechanical standpoint fit well with the ship. We thought that was such a good fit that it made sense to really lean into that bomber role. The other thing is, if you look at the design of our ships, the Y-Wing has always been intended to be kind of a spectrum between going all bomber and more of a dogfighter or somewhere in between. We give you quite a bit of flexibility. With the B-Wing, we've gone even further to the right. So it can dogfight, but at the most, it's going to be a backline fighter that's kind of providing, think of it like artillery support. Whereas on the other extreme, it is a bomber that is good for dropping bombs and nothing else, and you darn well better escort it. In terms of team composition, the thing with the B-Wing is that it is the farthest thing over on the extreme of kind of the I just murder people to I just murder capital ships spectrum of our different ships. And so it's something that doesn't work well on its own. This is a ship that benefits tremendously from being paired with the U-Wing, and to a lesser extent by being paired with other ships that can support and protect it on its way to the destination. Similarly, you can set it up to be more of a dogfighter, but even in that case, it's not going to be flying around in the middle of everything the way that an A-Wing would. It stays more at a distance, and while everyone else is keeping the enemy busy, it just guns them down, tremendous artillery. So it's very much a ship that leans into teamwork. You don't want to run B-Wings without the support of your buddies.
And that was every Starfighter in Star Wars Squadrons.
We hope this has helped you understand the game a little bit better and brought that galaxy far, far away a little bit closer to home.